Chapter 19: The Merits and Defects of Gold as Money. Chapter 1: Public Confidence and the Myth of Stability. To understand the gold standard, one must first understand that it was built upon a foundation of collective faith, a psychological architecture so powerful that it dominated the human mind for millennia. The primary merit of gold was not its conductivity or its resistance to tarnish. It was its ability to command public confidence. In a world of shifting political borders and collapsing dynasties, gold stood as the immutable sovereign. This confidence was rooted in the perception that gold possessed an intrinsic value, a geological honesty that existed independently of any king's signature or any bank's ledger. When a merchant in the bustling ports of the 1890s accepted a gold coin, they were not just participating in a transaction. They were witnessing a miracle of universal trust. That coin represented a fixed quantity of human labor and geological rarity, recognizable from the frozen banks of the Yukon to the humid docks of Singapore. This psychological anchor provided a sense of permanence in an era of rapid industrial change. People believed that if they held gold, they held the very essence of time and value, captured in a cold, heavy yellow disk. However, this stability was often a carefully maintained myth. While the gold standard effectively prevented the explosive hyperinflations that occur when governments print paper money to fund wars, it subjected the global economy to a different kind of slow, grinding torture: systemic deflation. The stability of gold was essentially a straitjacket. Because the supply of money was tied to the random, erratic discoveries of new mines, the world's economy was at the mercy of the Earth's crust. If the global population and industrial output grew by 5%, but gold production only grew by 1%, the value of every gold coin rose, causing the prices of bread, land, and labor to plummet. This created a world where the confidence of the wealthy creditor was bought at the price of the despair of the debtor. The myth of stability was real for those who held the gold, but for the farmers of the American West or the laborers of the industrial North, the gold standard was a golden shackle that made their debts heavier and their futures more uncertain with every passing year. Chapter 2: The Automatic Nature of the Gold Standard versus Managed Currencies. The most celebrated and perhaps most feared merit of the classical gold standard was its automaticity. Under this regime, the global economy functioned like a vast, self-correcting machine, governed by the cold laws of physics rather than the shifting whims of human committees. There were no Federal Reserve chairs to adjust interest rates, no quantitative easing to stimulate growth, and no political debates over the money supply. The system was a monetary clockwork. If a nation exported more than it imported, gold flowed in, the money supply expanded, and prices rose. Conversely, if a nation spent more than it earned, gold flowed out, the money supply contracted, and the economy was forced into a cold, hard correction. This unthinking machine provided a level of interstate honesty that modern systems struggle to replicate. It acted as a natural censor on the ambitions of politicians. Because the money supply was anchored to a physical substance that could not be created by a printing press or a computer keystroke, governments were forced to balance their ledgers. If a king or a parliament wanted to spend more than they had, they could not simply print the difference. They had to tax their citizens or borrow real physical gold from the market. While this automatic nature provided a magnificent discipline, it was also the source of its political fragility. In a managed currency system, the world of fiat money we inhabit today, human experts have the flexibility to print money to prevent a bank run or to fund a social safety net. But this flexibility is a double-edged sword. It removes the natural veto of gold, leaving the value of a citizen's life savings at the mercy of a committee's judgment. The gold standard was an impartial judge. It was brutally honest, but it lacked a heart. It did not care about unemployment, social unrest, or the suffering of the poor. It only cared about the balance of the scale. 3. Defects: Scarcity, Rigidity, and Blind Natural Forces. Despite its discipline, the gold standard possessed a fatal flaw: its absolute rigidity. The global economy is a living, breathing, and expanding organism, but the supply of gold is a blind natural force governed by the random lottery of geology. The greatest defect of gold as money was its inelasticity. The fact that the amount of money in the world depended not on the volume of trade or the genius of inventors, but on how much yellow metal happened to be buried in the crust of the earth. This created a scarcity trap. During the late 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution exploded and the production of goods tripled, the gold supply lagged behind. This led to a monetary drought. Because there wasn't enough metal to facilitate all the new trade, the value of each coin skyrocketed, effectively strangling the economy. It was a bizarre reality where a farmer could produce twice as much wheat as the year before, yet still go bankrupt because the price of wheat had dropped by half, simply because gold had become scarce. Furthermore, the system was dangerously vulnerable to shocks. A massive new gold discovery in a place like Nome or the Klondike would cause a sudden, unmanaged surge in prices, inflation, while a period of no discoveries would lead to a grinding recession, deflation. Relying on the geological luck of a few prospectors to determine the stability of global civilization was, as its critics argued, a form of economic superstition. The gold standard linked the fate of the modern factory and the high-tech steamship to the primitive, blind forces of the shovel and the sluice box. 4. The cost of maintaining a metallic standard. There is a profound, almost Sisyphean irony at the heart of the gold standard: the staggering resource cost required to sustain it. To maintain a hard currency, a civilization must divert an immense portion of its human genius, physical labor, and capital toward a singular repetitive task. Thousands of men endured the sub-zero terrors of the Klondike and the brutal heat of the Rand, burning through mountains of coal and tons of dynamite, all to extract a metal that would ultimately be transported across oceans and placed back into the darkness, this time in the fortified vaults of a central bank. Economically, this is known as dead capital. In a fiat or digital system, the cost of creating $1 billion is the mere whisper of a computer fan or the stroke of a pen. But in a gold system, every new dollar must be wrested from the earth. This was a high-tax system on human productivity. However, proponents of the metal argued that this cost was not a waste, but a necessary sacrifice. The labor required to find gold was the very thing that protected it from being devalued. It was an insurance premium paid to ensure that money remained a physical reality rather than a political illusion. The environmental scars on the Seward Peninsula were, in a sense, the receipts for a century of monetary honesty. 5. Gold as a buffer against political inflation. The final and most enduring merit of gold, one that haunts modern economists to this day, is its function as a protective buffer against the seductive power of the printing press. Throughout history, the greatest threat to a citizen's wealth has not been theft by a criminal, but the invisible tax of inflation levied by a desperate state. Whether it was the Roman Empire debasing its denarius, or 20th century governments printing paper to fund world wars, the pattern is eternal. When governments have the power to create money, they eventually create too much of it. Gold acts as a metallic constitution. Because it cannot be synthesized in a lab or printed at the whim of a treasury secretary, it imposes a hard limit on the ambitions of the state. Under a gold standard, a government cannot spend more than it can collect in taxes or borrow in hard money. This forces a level of fiscal sobriety and long-term planning that is rarely found in the era of managed paper. Gold was the veto power of the individual. In the classical era, if the public felt the government was being irresponsible, they would simply present their paper notes and demand their gold, draining the national reserves and forcing the politicians back to reality. It was a cold, silent check on power, a physical boundary that even the most charismatic leader could not talk his way past. It is this discipline of the metal that remains gold's greatest legacy, and the reason it continues to be hoarded by central banks today, as the ultimate shield against a world of debt.